So the session order is switched a little, but we have a special guest from France. Everyone wanted to see. Here is Remi Rousselet. Thank you. And the
Hello.
session title is Riverpod 3.0, the preview. Thank you.
Hello, konbanwa. I guess first of all, maybe we should take a round of applause for the organizers. It's been a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. To be honest, it's been a long time since I wanted to visit Japan, and apparently a few tweets are enough to make a conference here. So thanks for having me, and hopefully we'll have a nice talk. Yeah. So I guess let's get started, and maybe wait for the last few people to sit down, and it should be good. Yeah, so tonight I want to, today I guess, well not tonight quite yet. I want to use this opportunity and to talk about Riverpod 3. Oh, give me a second. It's not the official release quite yet. I just want to show what's coming, and maybe a preview will be coming soon, but I'll talk about this more later. So what I'm going to do here is show the plan. A bunch of it is already implemented, and so I'm just explaining everything. Okay, so let's get started. Yay! So first of all, I guess an important stuff is stabilizing the package. So lots of bug fixes. Various performance optimizations, especially if you're using code generation. Things should be much faster, not necessarily for the code generation part, but the generated code is faster. Also, a cleanup of the public API. A bunch of types that were kind of like polluting the auto-completion are now gone. To expand on that a bit more, basically, you know, when you define a provider, there is this provider, and then there is the auto-dispose provider variant. Same thing with notifier. You can type notifier or auto-dispose notifier. Lots of subtypes like that. Now, all of them are gone now. The feature is still here. It's not that auto-dispose is getting removed. It's just that when you specify that the provider is marked as auto-dispose, you don't necessarily now need to use auto-dispose notifier. You can just use the normal notifier, for example, in this case. And the associated compilation error is now moved to lint error instead. Then after that, all the ref, the typical ref object, ref subclasses are now removed too. So like if you use provider, you add provider ref. If you use a stream provider, you add a stream provider ref. It was an interesting concept, but technically there is really not much difference between ref object between providers. So just to simplify the public API, we're just going to stick to ref. And then I'm also going to move the different kind of semi-outdated classes to a different import. So now state notifier, state provider, state notifier provider, change notifier provider, a few of those are now no longer part of the default import. You have to import them through riverpod/legacy.dar. And they likely would be removed in the 4.0 version at some point, maybe. And of course, there is a quick fix for this migration to make it easier on you. If you migrate to 3.0, a quick fix should enable you to automatically migrate to the new import. The point is just to stop promoting things that are no longer the most up-to-date stuff to do. So now, for a newcomer, they would know maybe they shouldn't use state notifier, for example. Anyway, that's for the boring stuff. Let's talk about more interesting stuff. So one of the first new features is generic providers. By that I mean we can now use type arguments inside providers. So for example, when you annotate a class notifier, you can specify type argument t in here. And then, of course, you can use it anywhere in your class as usual. And now, when you use a provider, it works kind of like when you use the when you specify arguments on your provider. But now the argument is just the type argument, and the return value and stuff like that change in consequence. Of course, this is unique to code generation. We can't really do the same thing without code generation, unfortunately. So you would have to use code generation in this scenario. And of course, we're not limited to a single to classes. We can use functions too with the same pattern, and we can use more complex use cases too. So we can tell type arguments to extend specific thing, or maybe specify multiple of them. There is no restriction here. Well, this example is a bit pointless, but whatever. Okay, onto an exchange. It's not super interesting on its own, but it has interesting consequences. Basically, now, today, if you specify a provider and you override it, be it at the root of the widget tree or inside the widget tree, somewhere deeper in your application, currently it's okay. But in the future, you will only be able to override providers from the root provider scope unless they specify explicitly that they can be scoped. So if I go back here, this doesn't, the provider doesn't specify that it's going to be scoped, so it wouldn't be allowed to scope it. You get a runtime error in this scenario. And then if you want to explicitly mark a provider as scoped, you have to use the dependencies flag and you specify an empty array. In this scenario, it explicitly tells Riverpod that this provider can be scoped. This has a few benefits because now the performance of non-scoped provider can be way faster. Because now when we use a non-scoped provider, we don't have to consider the fact that they may be scoped, even if they aren't. And there are also other things I'm going to mention. Of course, to avoid the runtime error, there is also a warning that's implemented. You can use Riverpod lint. It will give you a warning if you may overrode a provider in a place where it shouldn't be. And now that when we're on the topic of scoping providers, there is also a slightly easier syntax for scoping providers. So instead of specifying this empty array on dependencies, which is the current syntax we have to do nowadays, wait. Sorry, I got confused. You can now specify an abstract method on the notifiers, for example. You can see here the build method here is abstract, which is the equivalent of just marking it as unimplemented, for example, and then also specifying the empty dependencies array. And you can do the same thing with functions, but unfortunately it would require macros, which is an upcoming Dart feature, because at the moment you cannot define a function with no body like this. And of course, you can use it as usual. Yeah. The problem is scope providers. If you at the moment forget to override a scope provider, you would get a runtime error. And again, you know, I don't like runtime errors. So that's the reason why so far I haven't promoted scoped providers too much. But in this version, I'm trying to offer you a solution to this problem. So I'm going to introduce a new annotation, at dependencies. At dependencies is pretty much the equivalent of the dependencies array we specify on providers, but that we can place anywhere. So be it on consumers, but also any function whatsoever, or any random class. And when you do so, it marks the associated element as using a potentially scoped provider. So here, for example, we annotated a consumer widget because our widget is using a scope provider here. So we listed that scope provider in the at dependencies. And the benefit is, by doing that, the linter is now able to give you an error if you forget to override a provider when you try to use that widget. So now you cannot forget to override scope providers anymore. Yeah, that's it. And now that we have safe scope providers, I'm also adding new features that are kind of depending on it. In part, one of the most common requests is, if you're familiar with passing parameters to providers, you might have complained about how it's inconvenient to pass the provider parameters around to different widgets. Maybe you have two different views that want to use the same parameters for your provider. And at the moment, you have to pass it to every widget constructor. So there is a new syntax for this. Now, when you define a widget provider with parameters, you can you can still pass parameters, obviously, but you can also optionally just pass the provider itself without any parameter, and add dependencies before, because when we don't specify parameters on the provider, it obtains kind of scope provider in the sense. Basically, you have to define in a previous point the providers you want to use for the default behavior. So here now, if we want to use the example widget, we have to override the default parameters for that part of the widget tree. And so from there, every usage of the myFamily provider would use those arguments if we don't specify any. Of course, another common complaint, the mounted check, because you might have noticed that if you try to use a ref on a disposed provider, you get a runtime error. And at the moment, it's not quite easy to check if a provider is disposed. There are some technical reasons for that, but I'm going to cover them. But now, first, we can now finally do if is mounted and stop. And the reason why we can do that is because there is a different breaking change. Basically, you might know that at the moment, when you use notifiers, for example, if you use ref.watch in a notifier and the listened provider changes, the notifier instance currently isn't recreated, so you can have properties on the notifier and the state will be preserved. This is likely going away with the 3.0 for the sake of having this mounted check. So now, if you have some properties on notifiers, they might not work anymore, unfortunately. Yeah. So next, there is a slightly simpler way of testing stuff. At the moment, if you've tested stuff in Riverpod, you might have copy-pasted this create container utility from the documentation, which is basically an utility for creating a provider container and then automatically disposing it after the test ends. But it's a bit tedious and nobody wants to use this utility. They sometimes make the mistake of using the provider container directly, for example. So now there is a slightly simpler way of doing it. There is a different constructor on provider container. You can do provider container.test, and it will automatically do the same thing. It's basically the create container utility, but built directly in Riverpod. Another cool feature, one of my favorites, but probably not that useful for you, usually, is you can now listen to a provider without initializing it directly. Basically, you can, when you ref.listen a provider, you can optionally specify this weak flag. And what this means is the listener will be registered, but it won't cause the provider to be initialized. But you would still get notified if the provider were to change at some point. So it enables you to do maybe some logging the state of a provider, or maybe reacting to what's the word? Like maybe you don't necessarily want for sure to depend on a provider, but if that provider were to exist, you might want to listen to changes on that provider. This can, for example, be combined with the ref.exist method if you're familiar with it. But yeah, of course, in most of the time, you won't need this flag. I just like it. There we go. Oh, again, I guess. Yeah, and I guess one of the more interesting one for you in comparison is finally we have some mutation support for 3.0. It's been a long-standing issue in Riverpod. For those who are not familiar with mutations, it's basically a way of solving a common UI problem where we have some operation we want to do, like for example a post request, and we want in the UI to show the status about this post request, for example. And the issue is Riverpod at the moment tells you not to do post requests in like a future provider, for example. It's considered not a good pattern. And there's a page covering this in the documentation. But at the moment, making post requests is kind of tedious if you want to have this UI pattern. And so Riverpod is introducing a new functionality to help solve those better. So in short, first you typically define your notifier as usual. But now what you can do is you can add a static method on those providers. This syntax may change in the future. I'm not fully decided on it yet, but for now the current syntax is a static method that you annotate with @mutation, like this. And it tells Riverpod it's a mutation method. And this mutation method is expected to return a new state after it has been invoked. And it takes, of course, all the parameters you would want to do your mutation. So here, since the notifier is a to-do list, it takes a new to-do that you want to add to the list. So in here, you can do your usual stuff. You can do a post request to publish the to-do. And then, like I mentioned, you now have to return the new state of the notifier from that method. So depending on your API design, the way of implementing this might change. So for example, in this example, it assumes that the API returns the new state. So for example, when you do your post request, it returns the new to-do list in that case. But if your API doesn't do that, you could also, for example, manually create a new list, update it. The consequence of this approach, for example, would be that it might not be in sync with the server in case of, for example, the post request failed but didn't admit the correct error, the correct code. You might be out of sync, for example. And then, now that we defined a mutation, we can now use those mutations inside the UI. So for that, we can use the typical consumer widget. And we can now ref.watch that, oh, the syntax is wrong. It's not notifier here. It should be @todo. So to-do list provider dot @todo, and it returns a special object to manipulate this @todo operation. So ignores the .notifier, assume it's the correct one. And then we can do a pattern matching on that @todo object. It's not an async value, it's a new type of object. It's a mutation state object. Because this mutation state object has a new state, which is the empty state. Because, of course, for side effects, you might not have triggered the side effect yet. So the first thing we could do is, if nothing has been triggered, we show a basic button and with default text. Then, while the operation is pending, we show a progress indicator. And we disable clicking on the button again because we don't want to keep submitting the post request. Then we handle error cases, maybe show the button in red. Maybe we can use this .retry to retry the operation with the same arguments that were submitted previously. So this way you don't have to copy-paste the logic of the unpressed. And of course, you can also handle the success scenario to maybe show a checkbox once the operation has succeeded. And an interesting thing with this feature is you don't have to do the logic all in the same widget. You could watch this line here in multiple places and handle, for example, the loading indicator in a different widget, and the operation status would still be shared between both widgets. So you could have the button starts the operation, but handle the spinner in maybe the app bar, for example. Yeah. Another cool one is now providers are automatically retried if you have an exception inside them with an exponential backoff. So basically, from now on, if you take this simple provider, which prints the current second, and then throw an exception, what it would print is 1 second, 2 seconds, 4, 8. The exact number might change by the time it's released. But as you can see, the second keeps increasing, and it increases more and more and more. And of course, you have the ability to customize the retry logic. So if you don't want the default behavior of like multiplying the delay by 2, you can make your own. You can limit the retry count to a certain number. You can use a different logic here. And also, if you want to customize it for all providers at once, and instead of specifying for just a provider, you can specify it on provider scope. It will apply to all providers. And lastly, I guess, but probably one of the cooler one, offline support. Basically, the idea is about saving the state of a provider directly inside, locally on your device to be accessible on a database. So the idea is on the provider scope object, you would specify some form of binding, which binds Riverpod to maybe shared preference, if you want to use shared preference, maybe PostgreSQL, whatever you want. Maybe not Postgres, but you get the point. And then you would need some form of serialization mechanism. Here in this example, I'm using the shared app preference here that I'm using. Assume that I'm using from to JSON, but if you're using a different connector, it might tells you to specify different methods. So don't look necessarily too much in the from to JSON. And then you can now mark a specific provider as needing to be saved offline. So you, on the annotation, you specify offline and you specify the table name, whatever that is. It needs to be unique across the application. So you can't have two providers using this table, the same table name. That would be kind of weird. And then you typically do the same thing as usual. You can just do a common network request. And no need to do anything special. And by default, from there, the first time the provider is used, Riverpod would attempt to read the database using the connector defined previously, and initialize the state accordingly. Of course, if it's empty, you get the usual loading. If it's not, you get the default state. But of course, there is the scenario about what if the model change. For example, what if your product now has a new required property, and of course the previous database state might not be up to date anymore. You would get an exception because the property would be missing. So what you can do is you can optionally specify a destroy key when you migrate your when you update your model, and whenever this destroy key here changes. So whenever you publish an application with maybe a different string here, the previous data published on the database will be ignored, and a new fresh state will be obtained instead. Of course, everything I showed here is still experimental. The exact syntax might not be exactly the same as shown here. For example, like I mentioned, mutations might not be static methods. Maybe methods on the notifier, stuff like that. But I'm aiming for a preview of everything I showed here somewhere during summer. Again, not sure about the exact date, but that's the plan. And a stable release somewhere near the end of the year. So yeah, that's about it for me. And thank you.
A lot of new exciting features are coming to Riverpod 3.0.
I hope so.
So nice. So we have 15 minutes for Q&A session.
Yeah, that was fast.
So we have maybe many of you wants to ask about Riverpod a lot. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand.
I'm gonna start from this side.
Okay.
Anyone? No? No one? Okay.
Thank you for your talk. And how is the documentation for your part updated?
That's a bit of a broad question. Let me think about it for a second. Of course, alongside the 3.0 release, there are plans to update the documentation, especially with all the new features that need to be documented anyway. I have a bunch of plans to improve the documentation. I think one of the major complaints at the moment is people have difficulties finding documentation to a very specific feature. I think one of the issues is that I've documented them inside the IDE documentation. Like when you hover async value in your IDE, you get the documentation of async value. But people don't necessarily think about this when they search on the documentation. So I'm thinking, for example, of having the website list every IDE documentation too there. That would make them more discoverable. Besides this, there are a bunch of tutorials that are coming. I bought a few UI kits, you know, those that offer a bunch of designs and application designs. And I'm going to implement them in Riverpod, ideally with most of those features. So with step-by-step explanation on how to do it. So I assume that should be a good, that should help many people there too. Hopefully, of course, if you have any suggestions on what else could be done to improve, I'm open to suggestions.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I'm looking forward to the stable release and trying the new features. My question is rather simple, and that is inside the build method, also for the current Riverpod like it's a question for the current version. Should I rather, like a notifier, should I rather read or watch it, or doesn't it matter?
Definitely watch. Yeah, I didn't list it here, but there are a bunch of lint rules that are coming soon. One of those lint rules is a lint rule which warns you if you use the incorrect method, like if you use read instead of watch or watch instead of read. And yeah, for sure, if you're inside the build method, either of a widget or a notifier, you need to use watch. There is no use case where you would use read at the moment. So yeah, definitely use watch.
Okay, so I should never use read.
Never. Yeah, it's not like sometimes, it's never.
All right. So we could remove the method.
No. There are use cases for read specifically, but not in the build method.
I see.
No.
Thank you.
Oh, there's one here.
Front?
Oh, two more. Yeah.
Thanks, Remi, for your talk. I have a question. Is there any news about DevTools extension?
Yeah, for sure. Of course, again, I didn't include it here because I'm still working on it and I have some plans for it. I could have released something simple that just shows the current state of your providers. I'd like to do something a bit more advanced than this, though, because I feel like if it's something not many people will use, there is not necessarily much value in working on that. I'm considering things like showing the state of a provider over time, including, for example, with the mutation feature or offline stuff. I want to show, for example, the state in the database versus the current state, or for example, listing the method that changed a state, the last change, which method triggered this state, so that are more useful for debugging, which is why it's taking a bit of time. But yeah, it's definitely high on my to-do list.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I have two questions. Are you alone to improve the make provider package or team with other engineers?
By the main provider package, you mean the non-Riverpod one, the older one?
No, the third version provider third, or yes, older version. Are you making this package alone or several engineers collaborating?
Yeah, it's mostly alone. Some people contribute here and there, especially on the documentation. I receive a bunch of documentations for translations in many different languages. Sometimes I get a few bug fixes, which is nice. Or like issues too. Technically, issues are a way of contributing, like suggesting features, stuff like that. But yeah, the code is mostly me, I would say.
Okay, thanks. Last question is, what is the motivation to, to this huge project? Because so many Flutter engineers are counting on your contribution, right? So it's not your job, but what is the motivation?
I mean, let me think for a second. First of all, I would say it's an interesting challenge to work on. I like solving problems, and one of the reasons I worked on those packages is I wasn't necessarily satisfied with what was offered, and of course, what many developers tend to do in this case is they write their own way of doing it. I just took the extra step of publishing it. But I'm sure many of you kind of wrote some form of state management package. It's just not available on pub. Yeah, you could say it's fun.
Okay, thanks.
I had exactly the same question, so thank you for asking.
Yeah, a few people asked me the same question today.
Yeah, it's a quick one. Thank you for the talk. It's regarding the macros. Maybe you've seen that macros is already there. Well, I mean, it's not there, but it's coming next.
Of course.
And you invest a lot of time on the Riverpod code generation. So I don't know, are we gonna see any change on code generation? Is it gonna be more on macros? Anything?
Yeah, of course. The plan for code generation has always been to move them to macros when they are available. It's just a question of when will they be available, and also the topic is always about the limitations that macro will have. They are not necessarily fully specified at the moment, so it's for example, it's difficult for me to know for sure whether the syntax will be the exact same. For example, one of these things, because earlier last month I think I tried migrating the Riverpod generator to macros, but lots of things are missing. And one of the things that was missing that triggered a discussion on with the DAR team is about, let me find a good one. I'm looking for a notif here. No. There we go. Yeah, of course, with macros, you wouldn't need this extends anymore.
Yeah.
But the thing is, at the moment, Riverpod is able to determine the type of a provider just based on the return type of the build method. And one of the things that's not necessarily clear is whether this will still be possible with macros. Hopefully it will be, but otherwise we might have, for example, to specify the return type of the build method on the Riverpod annotation too. So it's still being discussed on the language repository. We'll have to see.
Do you know if there's any other limitation that maybe will be?
Yeah, one of the things I'm not necessarily sure about is that's also one of the reasons why offline support has been taking some time. Let me check it here. Yeah, because like when we do migration here, this migration example is it works right when you modify your model. But another case is when you delete a provider, for example. We might want to delete the associated table. but this involves knowing the list of all the deleted providers, which could be challenging to do with macros. With build runners, there are ways to do so because we could obtain the list of all providers inside the project. But obtaining the list of all providers inside the project with macros is still, again, it requires discussing with the language team on how to do that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your amazing talks. My question is about this offline caching new functionality. And in the previous slide, you showed us that you have something like called shared app preference as JSON. So does that mean that the concrete implementation of offline connector is upon to developer? So we can choose our arbitrary source of data to store data, or you provide any stuffs like in-memory stuffs predefined?
I might provide directly in Riverpod an in-memory caching for the sake of testing specifically. Otherwise, you likely wouldn't need any in-memory caching for typical applications. But for like for example, this shared app preference as JSON stuff would be in a different package. It wouldn't be directly in Riverpod, and of course we could have many connectors for, like I mentioned, SQLite, whatever, Realm. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Remi, for making my life easier for the post request. I was just struggling a lot. Okay, I have 3 questions for you. Number 1 is like for hooks widget, local state managing. So using hooks is a bit difficult. Do you have plan to make
hooks simpler?
Yeah, I mean including the official library. I mean not including the.
Yeah. In a sense, I feel like I already done that with Riverpod, because in a way, Riverpod is inspired from hooks. It's just a different syntax. I would like to keep the Flutter hooks package as close to how React is used and keep my custom take on the hook pattern as a separate project. So the question would now more be about whether I would for example, offer inside Riverpod a way to handle local state inside widgets. I've considered making reusing the provider syntax, but maybe offering a different way of watching providers inside widgets that would be for local state. I've considered it. I'm not necessarily sure whether there is the demand for it. I'm thinking about it. I might create an issue about it at some point and maybe ask for upvotes or downvote about it. For now, I haven't done so mainly because I don't necessarily want to add more features, too many features, because otherwise people often complain that there are lots of stuff in Riverpod, and even though I feel like most of it is really useful, of course some people may disagree.
Yeah, thanks. Second one is like, we have to watch inside the build function, right? Inside the build, we watch. So that object I need to use in multiple functions in a class. So I feel like very difficult passing in, all the functions, same objects. So it's possible for like in the class level, like inside init state, something to watch once, take a class level variable for the objects, and I can easily use.
You mean having to watch the same provider inside the notifier?
No, I mean in the widget class level variable, I want to keep the objects, which I watch in the build function, right? Currently we have to watch, but I want to watch at the class level so that I can use that variable in multiple functions.
The challenge is that one of the important reason why it's inside the build method is it enables Riverpod to know when the provider stops being used. Because for example, if the build method were to be re-executed, but it stops calling ref.watch on that specific provider, Riverpod would know that it needs to stop subscribing to that provider. And supporting other life cycles for this might break this promise. It might make things trickier. Otherwise, like for example, if we have to write a needed state for this, it would be quite verbose just for that. I'm not sure we would gain a lot compared to just using ref.watch multiple times. So I would like a simpler way of doing that, but if we just declare it as a property on a state, that would break the promise I mentioned before. So I'm not sure if there's really a solution here, and I'm not necessarily sure about whether the problem is worth introducing a new syntax for this.
I mean, in the build function, you can automatically detect how many times a build is going on, and you can just manage whatever you are doing right now. I mean, manage the objects. So,
what do you mean?
I mean, for this question, just define the class level variable. So you can like dispose and update that variable automatically. You can detect the build function calling, right? I mean, it's difficult to do.
I'm not necessarily fully sure about what you're saying here. Oh, sorry. I guess it probably would be better to for you to show me what you have in mind after. Like maybe we could code.
Okay. I'll go for the last question.
Yeah.
So, what if Flutter release its own official state management library better than the Riverpod? What you will do?
Good luck. For me or for them? I mean, first it would be interesting because I would have to see what they release, and then it would be interesting to see the reaction of the community, because the community tends to be a bit divided about what's the approach we need to use, especially in Flutter. I probably wouldn't like, from what my guess is I wouldn't like what they would offer, and probably would still suggest something else. But I would consider looking at why they released it this way and why they think it's better, and how I can use this knowledge to improve my own packages.
Okay. I mean, you can start proposing to Flutter. I mean, Flutter official. You can make your library official. Like, do you have plan to propose or something like that?
The thing is, it sounds nice on paper, but it probably would take months and months of discussion and back and forth with the team, because they don't necessarily like the idea. And it would require a lot of effort, which could be spent on improving the package instead. So there is this difficulty about, because if I spend months of discussion with the team and it ends up being, no, we don't want custom state management in Flutter anyway, it's just wasted effort. But yeah, I mean, if the Flutter team is open to having state management stuff, I'm open to join the discussion and make my own suggestions.
Okay, then maybe I can start one discussion somewhere.
Yeah. If you want to take that steps, for sure, I can follow.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for insightful session and Q&A again. So please give a big round of applause to him. Thank you. So for more discussion, you can go to the Ask a Speaker corner. Then we have a 15 minutes break. The next session is starting at 6:20. Thank you. Next one is the last session for today.